This is Jerome Corsi, and we're at thetruthcentral.com. Today is Monday, April 24th, 2023. Thank you for joining us. We have a lot of news to cover today. We're going to jump right into it. Our first story has to deal with what's going on in the war in Ukraine. And I've been following this very, very carefully because we're getting a lot of disinformation about what is happening. The NATO and the European Union press, Washington, are all saying there's going to be a Ukrainian counteroffensive in the spring, which is going to try to cut off Russia's access to Crimea. Russia needs a corridor where they can get to Crimea in order to maintain the ports, Sevastopol and the Crimea area, which have control over the Black Sea, which is Russia's access to the Atlantic Ocean through the Mediterranean. Now, the major story, I think, at the moment is this Bakhmut, which is a town that is in the eastern part of Ukraine, which is Russian-dominated. Donbass is the major region. And what's happening is Russia is systematically destroying the city. The Ukrainian forces are trying to hold out. They've been battling at the western edge of the city for weeks, and very high casualties, I believe, on both sides, although the Ukrainians, I think, are taking the major hit on this. And Russia's just shelling the city. The city is, take a look at the city. The city is in rubble. There used to be 70,000 people who lived in the city. Now it's not inhabitable. There's no water. There's no electricity. The buildings are all bombed out. Russia has systematically destroyed the city, and Russia is systematically destroying Ukraine with missiles and other weapons. To some extent, the troops are involved, but also this Wagner group is involved, which is a private army that Russia is using around the world. It's also in Africa. It's involved in the Sudan. We're going to be covering the Sudan a little bit more carefully this week, because there's a war in Sudan going on. Russia's involved, supporting one of the generals who is involved in a civil war. Sudan, of course, is a very strategic location on the Red Sea, which is dividing essentially Africa from Saudi Arabia. And this is, again, an expansion through paramilitary action of Russia's influence throughout the Middle East. The Ukraine situation, I think, is not winnable for the Ukrainians. The Russian advances have closed in on Ukraine's supply roads to western Bakhmut. Moscow is taking control of a few hundred yards of one road on Friday, but Ukraine is still maintaining it can ferry soldiers and supplies in as needed. I think you've got in the Bakhmut situation a propaganda war going on because Ukraine is constantly demanding more money. This leads to the second story that I want to cover today on The Truth Central, which is essentially that Ukraine is again asking for endless streams of money. So this was picked up by ZeroHedge.com. I follow it very closely. It's a good website. After several days after the Russian lawmakers penned a letter to President Biden demanding that endless military aid to Ukraine, basically the Republicans are saying it's got to be halted. The Ukrainian Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Melnik tweeted that the Western nations need to do more. He said, "We are thankful to our allies for their military help, but it is not enough." That's what Melnik tweeted over the weekend. He said Ukraine needs 10 times more money to finish the Russian aggression this year. And he called upon the Western partners to cross all artificial red lines and devote 1% of their gross domestic product for weapons deliveries. Well, the two major winners here are the arms makers, which can't get enough employees. Right now, there's demand in the United States and Europe for more people to work in the arms industry. They're benefiting tremendously. They always do. The main beneficiaries in war are the people who are making the weapons to kill each other. And that's happening again. And also, Ukraine is famous for corruption. So we're not taking careful, the United States is not taking careful accounting of these millions that we're sending over to Ukraine. And what Melnick's letter is demanding comes as the Biden administration has just approved a package last Wednesday that was worth $325 million more in military aid. The U.S. has supplied at least 36 weapons packages since the conflict began in February 2022, costing U.S. taxpayers $35 billion. So essentially, Ukraine's asking for a blank check in order to keep fighting Russia. In the current situation, Ukraine essentially is demanding that we spend more billions, and Eastern Europe, Western Europe do the same, the NATO countries. And I see this as an endless pit. And the final analysis, Biden has got to understand that Putin will not lose in Ukraine. If he did, he's going to face being dislodged as the president of Russia. He can't afford to lose. He's not going to lose. He's increased conscription, made conscription being done now increasingly on a basis of electronic surveillance of the population, making sure those that are conscripted don't escape the country, and hiring as paramilitary forces. Russia has the ability to utilize weapons from Iran and China now, and we're just pushing Iran, China, and Russia into a closer alliance. Meanwhile, we're spending more billions of dollars sending over weapons in order to kill each other in a war that constantly threatens to expand into a nuclear exchange and be a prelude to a World War III. I think it's a very dangerous situation. And Russia has been at conflict with Ukraine going back hundreds of years. Russia covets access through Ukraine to the Black Sea, and it's not about to allow this resource-rich Ukraine to become part of NATO. And if you remember the impeachment hearings of President Trump, our State Department has constantly wanted to expand NATO to Ukraine and Finland. They've now gotten Finland to join NATO, which again is pushing a threat on Russia's sphere of influence, and Russia's going to react. Chris, do you want to comment on this first story as we get going today?
You were saying it all along. Back in 2000, Vladimir Putin, however you want to pronounce it,
right?
He released his manifesto where he said NATO is one of the largest, if not the largest, threat to the existence of Russia. Maybe
Right.
those are just words, but the fact is he did not want border countries that might block his access to certain water bodies or other resources to join NATO. And this is what's happening now. The question is NATO provoking Russia, or is NATO trying to do something to flex its own muscles while Russia's flexing its?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I think what we've got to realize is we're going into a three superpower world, the United States, Russia, and China. Now, at the moment, we're a much larger economy, but the West is taking suicidal steps, which is going to throw us into a massive economic downturn, and we'll cover that in a minute. But again, Russia and China are going the other direction. They're exploring central bank currencies, digital currencies. They're trying to get the world off of the dollar as a reserve currency, and they're increasingly buying gold. Gold is the underlying theme here, and gold's going to be increasing in value tremendously. I want to cover that in a minute. But I think we're seeing that the expansion of NATO, I mean, in geopolitics, going back to Metternich, who was a major politician and one of the architects of Europe, before modern Europe, he basically had this, power formation by alliances where you would get these groups of countries who would be aligned together. And if they were enough balance of power between these different blocks of countries, you had stability because nobody wanted to go to war. Now, that's based on the premise that a country has a sphere of influence. In other words, the United States' sphere of influence naturally is the Western Hemisphere. Russia's sphere of influence includes Eastern Europe. And our sphere of influence includes Western Europe. China's sphere of influence includes Asia, all the way through to Pearl Harbor. I mean, China has ambitions over all of the Pacific, as does Japan. These are natural effects of geopolitics understood properly. And my degree is in political science. I know this is one of the issues that gets neglected when we look at the State Department, which has objectives. The American left has been antagonistic towards Russia since Russia abandoned communism with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the American left has embraced communism in China. And again, this is our fundamental ideological driven nature of American politics, where ideologically driven politics are very dangerous because it leads countries into popular delusions and wars. And I've been constantly, in the books I've been writing, The Truth About Energy, Global Warming, and Climate Change. And if you take a look at the books section, I've got another book in print right now, will soon be published, on the truth about neo-Marxism, cultural Maoism, and anarchy, which is what we're experiencing on the United States right now. There's the cover of the new book coming. You can see these books have very similar covers. It's a trilogy I'm writing. It's all called the Great Awakening Trilogy. I think if people get back to understanding the truth, get away from ideologically driven ideas into more fact-based, scientifically based, provable or disprovable concepts of reality, we're going to be in a much better position to live in ways that conform with the rules that God has set up, including economics, physics, and all kinds of other principles. We live in a rule-driven world, not one where we can posit through our wishes what we would like the utopia to look like. That's what's done under these neo-Marxism and cultural Maoism, and we see them to be very destructive ideologies, anti-family, anti-God. And again, these are principles which throughout human history have not been productive in terms of economic growth, economic security, political security. They tend to produce wars, disease, mass murderers, and other calamities. Now let's go to the next story, because these are very much related today. If we take a look at what's going on in the debt crisis, and again, this is, again, a little bit more of the economics, and the economics are somewhat more difficult, but if you just follow along, I think we can make this understandable. The United States is now faced with a critical problem, which is that our debt level has gotten to be very high, and the economic activity with the inflation and the increasing of interest rates has slowed down. Now, what this means is that monitoring the Internal Revenue Service tax receipts, which is what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does, Bureau of Labor Statistics actually is saying we've got supposedly 4 million jobs were created last year. That's the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But then take a look at the IRS statistics. Tax receipts coming in right now for 2022 are 30% lower. Now, if we really had more jobs, you would expect tax receipts to be higher. But the point is that the lower tax receipts in 2023 could bring what they call this X date, which they were saying was going to occur in October, back to occur as soon as June. So we are now in April. That's 2 months from now. The X date is when we hit the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling is passed by Congress, and when the United States reaches the debt ceiling, it has to be increased. Now, it will be increased, but again, we've just hit $1 trillion debt by the Biden administration in this increasing spending, and we have Medicare, Social Security, which are designed by law to continue expanding as the number of people in the population age. A percentage of population that's aging increases. So therefore, we've got a set in law need to increase these transfer payments to the older population. Now, ideologically, that's a good idea. But in terms of when the economics get to be where you don't have the revenue coming in, your debt increases, it has dire consequences. What are the dire consequences? Well, first of all, take a look at this article. What they're basically saying is that when tax receipts coming in to the Treasury are through April 20th, 35%, $138 billion below last year's levels, we're creating a crisis where pretty soon the Fed's going to have to step in and restart quantitative easing. The Fed's going to have to start buying Treasury bonds in order to make the financing of this increasing debt palatable. And again, it's an attempt to cut down interest rates. But the problem is this massive inflationary government debt, just spending. And there doesn't seem to be any limit to what Congress wants to spend, especially if we're going to be pumping more billions into Ukraine. And I'll come to another point very quickly in this discussion, and that is that as we implement these green energy policies, we're also destroying our economy, increasing our costs of energy. So we're taking exactly the wrong steps here. The federal government is subsidizing green energy again, like we did under Obama with Solyndra. We're going to do this new Inflation Reduction Act, which is really a green energy act, is going to pump more billions of dollars into green energy programs, which I'm saying won't work. In other words, you can't just will energy, solar electricity and wind electricity into being powerful enough to run a major industrial economy. We're going to have to rely on hydrocarbon fuels, or the standard of living is going to decrease dramatically. If the Fed starts buying Treasury bonds again, we'll be back into another inflationary situation. We'll have higher interest rates. The Fed will have to start increasing interest rates again, which will basically hurt the economic growth. So we are rapidly entering a period of stagflation, which occurred in the 1970s over the OPEC crisis. But we've also got a debt crisis where the banks are going insolvent, which is what happened in 2008, 2009. So we have a double whammy. We've got an energy crisis and a banking debt crisis, and this is going to be a major storm. So the fact that we're getting dramatically lower tax receipts, which is an indication of economic growth being stagnant, is a problem for us in the future. Chris, you want to comment?
And we have a government that's constantly denying this is happening, Jerry. They're telling you, hey, it was Putin's inflation over the years. No, don't pay attention to what happened beforehand. We saved Christmas by lowering the gas prices 7% a couple of years ago in the winter. This is what they're telling you. They're telling you, no, don't worry, there's nothing going on. By the way, climate change. And they're going to throw that at you to give you an emotional appeal and distract the masses from what's actually happening.
I agree. I mean, I'm also following very carefully this Biden story. It's interesting. I think the Hunter Biden crisis, the Biden family corruption, is finally becoming mainstream. I'm following articles in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. This is no longer considered a quote unquote conspiracy theory, the story has elevated. Now, I'm trying to decide. We'll watch it very carefully as it becomes mainstream. We'll begin to really get into the issue. Now, the question is for the Bidens. Joe Biden is probably going to announce on Tuesday that he's going to run for president. At least that's the scuttlebutt that we're getting out of Washington. Now, the question is, if Biden runs again, is this going to put the Hunter Biden story front and center? Because Democrats who also may want to run, and the ones I'm watching are Michelle Obama. She's got a book out. She seems to be really positioning herself to be president.
That's a very superficial type of a candidacy, but yes.
Well, but name recognition, and she's positioned her. Joel Gilbert has been doing excellent work on this, and I've been following him. We've been close friends over the years. And his various videos have highlighted that she is extremely political. We've known that since Obama was president. And the Newsom out in California seems to want to run. There's going to be other Democrats who want to run, and the Democrats have just basically canceled their debate among the Democratic presidential candidates because last time, 2020, the debates were a disaster for the Democrats. Democrats on stage pointing fingers and shouting at each other. They don't want that scene again. Now, if Biden is calculating that he wants to be president, he's going to tempt other Democrats who don't want him to be president, who are contending for the job, to perhaps encourage the investigations of Hunter Biden in order to remove Biden. Or does Biden think he has to stay president in order to control the bureaucracy and make sure that the Hunter Biden case and the corruption of the Biden family is excused? It's going to be a very interesting story to watch, and I'm watching it ever more closely now that the mainstream media is involved.
Well, let's take it back to 2008. And this is the funny thing. You're mentioning that the Hunter Biden story has become mainstream. 2008, Hillary Clinton was almost handed, or was about to be handed, the Democrat nomination for president. Unfortunately, it winds up that a prettier candidate came came by. Ted Kennedy moved his money from the Clinton campaign to the Obama campaign. All of a sudden, it was okay for the mainstream media to come out and bash Hillary Clinton over some associations in the past and what she may or may not have done in the Senate. All of it was like overnight, just like what's happening here, maybe a little more gradually, but it seems that there are powers that don't want Joe Biden to run again, or at least win again.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good comment and very astute. I think you're right. I mean, the forces within the Democratic Party are going to contend for who's in charge. And Obama's always been in the background. Obama had his vice president, Joe Biden. He always said on the record that he wanted to have a puppet president where he could really be pulling the strings from behind the scenes without being known or seen as doing it. Well, again, the Obama forces are strong. He's got Valerie Jarrett, who's still advising him. He stayed in Washington. He bought a very expensive house in a very trendy section of Washington, D.C. And this is going to be an internecine fight within the Democratic Party. The Republicans are also going to have an internecine fight between DeSantis, Trump, and the forces who want the GOP to be Democrat light. The GOP is no longer a conservative party. And again, the corruption that it pervades Washington seems to me to be ubiquitous. It's a problem. Let's move on to the next story, because all these things are related. The next story is what I'm following very carefully, because we're now seeing these youth mobs running amok in our major cities. What I picked up this past weekend was again in Baltimore. I know Baltimore very well. I've been into the harbor area many times. It's very close to New Jersey. And it was a beautiful little city for a long time. Go by it on the way to Washington, D.C. Now it's got shootings, carjackings, and muggings, which are out of control in the downtown area. Packs of teenagers just going through and wreaking havoc, not able to be controlled. Earlier this month in April, the Inner Harbor District, which is this beautifully redeveloped area, was overrun by hundreds of teenagers that resembled an apocalyptic scene from a Hollywood movie or Netflix movie, in which they just ran amok, destroying the city and threatening anyone who was there. Now, as a result, you can see the pictures, and it's in the Zero Hedge article we attached to, where the downtown areas, these very trendy shopping centers, are vacant because people are not going downtown. Why go downtown when it's dangerous? Well, the downtowns are becoming increasingly in major cities, especially in the northern part of the country, the blue states, are becoming empty. They're becoming democratic, basically democratically controlled, but ideologically run and increasingly unsafe. Now, why is this important economically? Because if there's no one going to these shopping centers, the people who own these shopping centers are going to be facing bankruptcy in the commercial real estate market. If that happens, that impacts banks right away, because banks are holding the debt from these commercial real estate buildings. If these various commercial buildings, these downtown shopping areas, etc., if the merchants just pull out, on Bed Bath and Beyond is declared bankruptcy over the weekend, again ideologically driven. They backed off of Mike Lindell's pillows, and conservatives began boycotting the company. So, Bath, Beds, and Beyond is now declaring bankruptcy. Well, again, that has major impacts on the banks who financed the company. And that's a major impact on the collapse of the economy. Because if the banks do not have a loan is a bank's assets. The deposits are a bank's liabilities. I know psychologically it's not how banks think about it, but it's how it's done in accounting. So if the loans begin to default, the banks do not have the asset base to remain solvent. That's a major problem. Now, I want to still cover a couple more stories, and we're going to get to them quickly. It's been a very big news day, and I want to stay on time, but I'm going to cover one or two more things quickly. This story here about the BRIC nations, which are essentially Russia, India, China, and Brazil, joined by other countries now, have declared this new development bank, which is a BRIC-owned bank, is going to provide loans not in dollars, but they're going to do it in the local currencies. Now, essentially, that's a way to avoid using the foreign exchange. In other words, they're not going to use dollars anymore, and it will end dependency on a single currency as part of the de-dollarization. This movement is gaining force as the U.S. dollar is becoming debilitated by increasing amounts of debt. And again, this is another indication that we're going to have this year a major economic collapse. Now, again, this is a reason why, if you go to our sponsors and pull down the Swiss America and take a look at this Walking Liberty half dollar, which you can fill out the form, and we'll be contacted by Swiss America and have an opportunity in an introductory first-time offer basis to buy, I think, up to 250 of these Walking Liberty half dollars, which are about 90% silver, at essentially their value in the silver itself. It's kind of a lost leader for Swiss America, but it's a way to get you introduced to the value of having some gold and some silver with tangible value. What we're going through right now, the economic crises that we're going through, going back to both the 1970s and 2008, 2009, in each of those cases, gold doubled in value. And I think gold is positioned to do that again. If you'll just talk to Swiss America, you'll get consultative selling, and you'll have the ability to own and hold real gold and silver, not certificates. Don't get into holding gold certificates or think if you get free silver certificates, they're worth anything. You want to actually hold the gold and silver itself. And that's what Swiss America is set up to do. I've worked with them for over 20 years, and they're an extremely reputable company. Now, the last article I want to cover today, which I think is also extremely important, has to do with what Germany is doing. This, again, is part of the insanity of the green movement. This past weekend, Germany's last 3 nuclear power plants were shut down. And that's been an effort by the radical green parties of Europe that want to close down nuclear energy. Now, the problem with this is it's only going to increase the cost of energy throughout the EU. The huge expansion of solar and wind capacity that Germany wants to do is no guarantee that the supply is going to be constant. In other words, just wishing and hoping doesn't make wind and solar work. So the country is going to be increasingly using coal instead of Russian gas, and mines in Germany that had previously been closed down, coal mines, have been reopened. German energy companies even started to dismantle a wind farm to allow for the expansion of a neighboring coal mine. The economics of wind and solar don't work. And this is part of the economic suicide the United States and Western Europe are going into. Chris, any final comments before we wrap up?
It looks like a lot of the West has been going towards that economic suicide direction for a very, very long time. For a while, it was economic unity, the Eurozone, and of course, the idea that America could pretty much hold its own in its own sphere of influence. It's like at this point, we have governments set up to abdicate such power to other nations, and now you're seeing the BRIC nations taking it and running. Is it because of is it something that was by design, or is it something that's done because of incompetence due to lack of foresight? Whereas the surface arguments, such as your climate change, hey, we have to stop that, or maybe your first world problem rights, that sort of thing, like which bathroom somebody can use or who can play in what sport, that sort of thing. Everything looks kind of fun on television at this point on the Western front, but the fact is that our house of cards has fallen, and it's being vacuumed up by as you said, the 2 newer superpowers.
Well, these things are ideologically driven.
Right.
And the green movement is not predicated on real science. Carbon dioxide is not the thermostat of the Earth's temperature. The sun is. And the sun is the major force of light and heat in the world, in the Earth. And the force is 70% of all greenhouse gases are water vapor. So, I mean, this is not a science-based initiative. This is an ideologically neo-Marxist effort that fundamentally wants to eliminate capitalism. And as such, this ideology is destructive to economic principles. We'll be covering this more. I want to stay on track with time. This is Dr. Jerome Corsi. This is Monday, April 24th, 2023. Please take a look at our sponsors. Will help us stay in production with this show. We're doing a lot of other posting on other websites. You can see that on the homepage. We're covering a lot of different areas in current events. Take a look at them. And we'll be introducing this new tool this week, hopefully, for analyzing mutual funds. I think you're going to find it very exciting. It's Dr. Jerome Corsi. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back every day this week. Weekdays, we're broadcasting. We'll be back tomorrow. In the end, God always wins. God will win here too. Thank you for joining us. God bless.